To today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Today we're joined by David Pilling, who is a writer and researcher passionate about history, especially the medieval era. Not surprisingly, growing up exploring Welsh castle ruins fueled this fascination. Yep, I can get that. He writes historical fiction and non-fiction, and is completing a 3-part series of novels on John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford. His non-fiction covers Edward I's campaigns and the Montfortian Wars. David's here today to talk about Llewellyn the Great, Llewellyn IV. Excuse my pronunciation, I cannot speak Welsh, so David will just have to correct me. And the and the Welsh royal house of Gwynedd. Welcome, David.
Hello, thank you. It's the double L that gets people.
Yeah, it's Llewellyn, isn't it? Is it?
Llewellyn, yes.
So, can you give us a little background on the House of Gwynedd?
Yeah, sure. So the House of Gwynedd in the medieval era was one of the 3 most powerful royal dynasties in Wales. There were lots of kingdoms and sub-kingdoms, but it was one of the big 3, if you like, Gwynedd, Powys and Deheubarth. And it goes all the way back to the 5th century, sub-Roman Britain, when a chap named Cynedda was said to have come down from the north of Hadrian's Wall, and conquered what became the Kingdom of Gwynedd. And I mean, the chronicle evidence for that era is pretty sort of dubious, and there's a lot of sort of traditions, and historians go back and forth on how Gwynedd was actually formed. But the sort of traditional version of events is that Cynedda drove out the Scotti, the Irish, from Gwynedd, founded this royal line, the House of Cynedda, and that was the start of the Royal House of Gwynedd. That went on for about 400 years, until you get to the mid-9th century, when an offshoot of the family basically rebooted it, and it became the House of Aberfraw, Aberfraw being the royal court, or Llys on Anglesey, just off the coast of North Wales, and a king named Anarawd, who was a sort of indirect descendant of Cynedda. He founded the House of Aberfraw, which is basically a sort of continuation of the original line, but via a sort of another branch. And that continued, his line continued until you get to the conquest of Wales in the 13th century. So basically the House of Gwynedd was split into 2 parts, but you can trace a more or less direct line back 700-800 years, even if the information is a bit spotty, sort of prior to the 10th century.
Did they have the Anglo-Saxons invading like the Normans did, or were they just neighbours?
There was a lot of conflict between the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Welsh kingdoms, but it wasn't really the same as what happens later post sort of Norman conquest, because the Saxon kingdoms weren't as organised. They were fighting each other as much as they were fighting the Welsh. And then you had periods where, for instance, the House of Wessex, Alfred the Great, was more of an ally to the Welsh kings than an enemy, and they tried to use his power by forging an alliance with him and his descendants to overcome their enemies in Wales. And you occasionally had sort of piecemeal conquests, like the Mercians invaded Powys in the 8th century, and they sort of conquered part of it, but not for very long. They were sort of kicked out again. And I mean, there's this sort of tradition that the initial wave of Anglo-Saxons came over and booted the Britons out of what became England and drove the Britons into what became Wales. And there's all kinds of arguments these days as to how true that actually is. Was it really a sort of concentrated invasion, or was it more of a sort of bitty process whereby small groups of Germanic invaders or mercenaries turned up and kind of took over the elites? Like, they might have knocked out a local dynasty, but the people who lived there didn't actually go anywhere. So you didn't have so much of a sort of Anglo-Saxon displacement as just kind of dynastic conflicts.
Yeah.
But then you'll encounter people who argue very strongly against that and argue that no, this was, like, a massive invasion, basically a sort of ethnic cleansing of the Britons, which is certainly how the medieval Welsh chroniclers chose to remember it. But what medieval chroniclers chose to say and what was the reality is,
Yes.
pretty. And it doesn't help that the compilers of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also chose to spin their own version of events in which their ancestors turned up, conquered the Britons. There's that wonderful song, the Song of Brunanburh, after Athelstan's great victory, which is basically this sort of hymn to imperialism. It's like we've crushed the Vikings and the Scots, and we crushed the Britons a few hundred years ago, and we are the rightful rulers of this island. I think it says more about attitudes than reality. So that's a long answer to your question. There was conflict, yes, but not any sort of concentrated attempt at conquest as you got under the sort of Norman and Plantagenet kings.
Yeah. So the House of Gwynedd has a long history, basically.
Oh yes, very, very long history, yes.
And we come to Llewellyn the Great, who I guess is the one that most, shall we say, those who aren't very versed in Welsh history might have heard of.
Yes.
Because of the conflict with Edward I. So how did he come to prominence?
Well, Llywelyn, also known as Llywelyn ab Iorwerth, he, depending on what you believe, the details of his early career are quite fantastic, really. His father was a man named Iorwerth Drwyndwn, which translates as Edward the Flat-Nosed. And again, the accounts are a little confused. One version of events is that poor old Iorwerth was born deformed, like he didn't have a nose. Although a more likely sort of version of events is that he suffered some kind of injury in battle and it left him deformed. He was the eldest legitimate son of a previous ruler of Wales named Owain Gwynedd, who was one of the sort of really dynamic, important figures of the royal house of Gwynedd. So Llywelyn, the man we're talking about, was one of his grandsons. And according to a Welsh poet named Prydydd y Moch, Moch means pig, by the way, so interesting name. According to him, Llywelyn first rose to prominence at the age of 10, that he started fighting his uncles for power in Gwynedd at that age, which is obviously ridiculous. I mean, admittedly, within medieval Wales, all able-bodied males were expected to fight from the age of 14, but 10 is really pushing it. I mean, that's just not likely. So the more likely sort of version of events, because Llywelyn's birth date is not really known, sometime in the late 12th century, is that around about the age of 15 or 16, he starts challenging his uncles for power in Gwynedd, because his grandfather, Owain Gwynedd, left a lot of sons. He had a lot of sons, and under the Welsh system of partible inheritance instead of primogeniture, they all inherited a piece of the pie. And inevitably, this happened time and time again in medieval Wales, they all started fighting each other to get a larger section of the inheritance. And this certainly happened in this case. Owain's brothers fought each other tooth and nail for control of Gwynedd, northwest Wales. And then Llywelyn, as soon as he came of age, he got involved. And he basically emerges from this interfamily conflict in about 1200 as the winner. He defeats his two most powerful uncles, Rodri and Dafydd, and his cousins. And although he's not really kind of established with a title at this stage, it's pretty obvious that he is the most powerful man to reckon with in North Wales. And he's only about 20 probably at this stage. So he's done a lot within a few years. And there's a lot of poetry and a lot of chronicle evidence for the battles he fought against his own relatives, which he won. He won them all. And so that's how this quite remarkable man first rises to prominence.
Do you think the partible inheritance thing is what kept... I mean, was it a problem for Wales that they did this partible inheritance? It sort of seems to have encouraged in-family fighting.
It was a problem in that sense, but it was also a very effective shield, because when the Normans conquered England, all they really had to do was kill Harold. I mean, there was resistance afterwards, but basically that was the big thing. You kill the head of state, you kill Harold, and defeat his army at Hastings. Whereas when they went into Wales a few years later, they discovered that there wasn't just one king to deal with, there were dozens of them. So you might knock out one or two, but that doesn't mean that the others are going to submit, and they didn't, of course. I mean, this sort of this conflict rumbled on in Wales for another 200 years. And the Welsh also had their own, they weren't stupid. They realised, you know, that the weakness inherent in their system. So what they used to do, if they were threatened by an external invasion, usually from England, they would unite against that for the time being until that crisis was averted. And then they would go back to their own lands and go back to where they were, because each part of Wales, each kingdom, each lordship had its own local laws and customs, and they didn't want to generally submit to someone else, another Welsh king or the King of England, because that might threaten their own sort of system, their own culture. But it's undeniable that having a system of partible inheritance whereby, you know, a man might have 6 sons, and over again they fought each other tooth and nail, and in order to defeat their brothers or their cousins, they would call in help from outside, and that of course gave the Normans and the English this kind of great opportunity, this sort of divide and rule policy. So yeah, it was a problem, and Llywelyn himself realised that, which is why he tried to do away with it. He tried to introduce the system that you had in England of primogeniture, the eldest son, which was very sensible, and he moved heaven and earth to try and push it through. But people didn't like it. The Welsh liked their customs, even if they were damaging, and they didn't really want to do away with them.
I wondered if it was a kind of cunning plan that, you know, it forces the people inheriting to fight amongst themselves, so the strongest emerges, and so you end up with a strong leader.
Well, there is, yeah, it's kind of Darwinian, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's true, actually, because generally the man who would emerge from this, you know, this sort of catfight would be, yeah, you get some very strong personalities, people like Llywelyn himself. And I mean, his main enemy, his uncle Dafydd, was the last ruler in Wales to explicitly use the title of king. He was the king of North Wales, and he, in his own right, was a very sort of formidable personality, and he'd previously defeated his brothers, and then a stronger man came along and knocked him on the head. I think what's remarkable about Llywelyn is that he does this so quickly. You know, he is maybe not even out of his teens, and his uncles are all very experienced, tough, you know, middle-aged guys, and they cannot cope with this sort of tyro who turns up and chases them all over the place.
I think that also is what surprises people about Welsh history, because it's so ingrained in us that it's princes, you know, they were princes in Wales and princes of Wales. When I wrote my book Silk and the Sword, I was writing about King Griffith, who Harold's wife was married to before she married Harold. And one person got very angry with me because there was no king in Wales. It's like, oh dear me.
It really does confuse people, because I've had people insist that there were no princes, that the title didn't actually mean that prince, that title was foisted upon them by the English as a way of downgrading their status, which is, I mean, that is such a misunderstanding. It was first used by Owain, Llywelyn's grandfather, in the Latin princeps. And that translates basically not necessarily as a prince in the sense we understand it, but as overlord. And when Henry II heard that Owain had adopted this title, he had a fit, because he realised what Owain was doing. He was claiming overlordship of all the other rulers of Wales by calling himself Princeps Walensis. And that's what Henry wanted to do. And it's a bit of a sticky one, because it does translate technically as prince, because that's the Latin root of the word in English, principes. But if you say prince as opposed to king, because of the modern meaning, people automatically go, oh, well, that meant they were downgraded. And I mean, if you could go back and ask Llywelyn, he'd have said, no, you haven't understood that at all, have you? Why would I downgrade myself? You know, I'm not an idiot.
Yes, and who's it? Dana Messer. Joan's biographer made a
Oh yeah.
point of that actually in her book,
Mm.
because Llewellyn's wife Joan was named Lady of Wales, and rather than Queen. And Dana
Yeah.
argues that just because she's not called a queen, it doesn't mean she isn't a queen.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was my interpretation would be that the Welsh rulers, particularly Llywelyn's dynasty, who were trying to impose their sort of power on the whole of Wales, they had to tread a fine line. And if they used certain titles, that might offend the Pope or the King of England. So, yeah, Lady of Wales. I mean, Llywelyn had several titles. He called himself Prince of North Wales, not Prince of Wales, Lord of Snowdon, Lord of Gwynedd. And nobody could object to those because that's what he was. But if he had come out with some grandiose title and called himself, as Griffith did back in the 11th century, a King of the Britons or King of Wales, that would be taken as provocation.
Yeah, I think we do get caught up in the language as we see it these days.
Yeah.
Like you say, it was political language in those days.
Yeah. I think these medieval politicians were a lot cleverer than we
give them credit for.
Than the average comment section on Facebook or YouTube is. It's sort of allowing
yes.
Yeah.
So Llewellyn, I mean, he was around at the time of King John and then Henry III. So what was his relationship with England?
Very complicated, because what Llewellyn wanted to do, and this is what his predecessors had done, was basically have a sort of working relationship with the kings of England. And in, I think, one chronicle, I forget who, he basically said that they sought to use the power of the King of England to overawe the other rulers of Wales. So if you had the King of England for a father-in-law and you had to deal with opposition in Wales, you could always call upon Dad to come and help you if it was in his interest. But at the same time, Llewellyn wanted to keep the kings of England at arm's length. So he wanted to have his cake and eat it. He wanted to use their power and their influence, but at the same time keep them out of his lands. And that's the whole sort of thrust, I think, of what he does with King John and Henry. He has some very dodgy moments with John, who, in my opinion, was a bit more formidable than people, generally, especially within Britain anyway. He has a very nasty moment in 1211 when John invaded Gwynedd and came as close as anyone before Edward I to actually conquering the place. And Llewellyn has to make this very sort of humiliating submission. But that's his nastiest moment. After that, he's more or less secure. And he manages to hold off Henry III. So it's a case of, I want to work with the kings of England, but at the same time, if they try and poke their noses in too much, then I'll fight them. And he does fight several wars. And he's generally, very, very successful. It's a very difficult sort of line to follow, because it could go wrong at any moment. But he does this very well in the end, about as well as anyone could, I think.
Yeah, especially when, I mean, England was such a powerful neighbour to have.
Yeah, exactly.
I think taking John's daughter as his wife was very clever, even though she was illegitimate and not a princess, technically, although she did later get legitimacy. It was that, because it's also, like you say, he can call on John to come in support, but he can also say to John, look, stay away, this is your daughter's land, you don't want to invade here because this is where your daughter lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll come on to Llewellyn's complex love life, but he does, again, he moved heaven and earth to get Joan recognised as legitimate. And one of the reasons for that is that he wants to show that this is a legitimate dynastic marriage with the King of England. We shouldn't interpret Llewellyn as somebody who was this sort of champion of Welsh independence against England, because that's not really what he's doing. He wants to sort of keep the Kings of England at arm's length, but he's pragmatic enough to realise that the days when you could hope to just drive out the English, as say Griffith tried to do back in the 11th century, it's like that's not happening, because the March of Lords are very firmly embedded at this point. The Earls of Chester and Pembroke, etc. Many of the Welsh dynasties are intermarried with the March, and Llywelyn's own family, his uncle David, who he had defeated, had married Henry II's sister, Emma Plantagenet, and really began this policy of let's intermarry with the ruling house in England because, we can use them to our advantage. And Llywelyn chooses to carry this on. And depending what you make of the sources, how ruthless he was in securing this marriage with Joan is a bit of a vexed question. I think he was prepared to do absolutely anything to secure this connection. From there, he uses their children to stitch together alliances with the martial lords. So he's all about intermarriage, really.
You mentioned a couple of times his tangled love life. He already had children before he married Joan, didn't he? From another relationship.
Yeah, well, I spent the last few days trying to remind myself, like, sort of bone up on this, because Llywelyn's, certainly his early kind of like marriage romantic history is very difficult to untangle. And the waters have been muddied recently because some sort of historians have come out and declared that he was actually married twice, whereas the old interpretation was that he was betrothed, but it was broken off before it came to a marriage because he was too closely related to the woman in question, who was a daughter of the king of the Isle of Man, named Runasht. And at the same time, he's supposed to have had a concubine named Tangwystel. And then he had at least one son by one of these women, generally supposed to have been Tangwystel. And we know this son existed, definitely, because Griffith, because he gave Llywelyn all sorts of trouble for the rest of his life. And this is before he marries Joan, King John's daughter. And I went into the sources because I wanted to be as precise as possible. And it's quite difficult because, for instance, Tangwystel, the earliest certain reference to her is from 1336. That's over a century after Llywelyn's death. It's only one passing reference, and she's not actually described as his mistress or his lover. It's not even certain what gender she is. He's described as his friend, which is an odd way to describe the mistress of this great Welsh ruler. And it's only later Welsh poets and genealogists from about the 16th, 17th century onwards who were very definite that this was a woman and this was Llywelyn's concubine. But then if you bring this subject up, sort of historians of Wales get quite antsy about it, and they insist that no, Tangwystel was definitely Llywelyn's mistress and Griffith was definitely her son. And then, as I said, there's this other theory that he did actually marry this daughter of the Isle of Man, the king of the Isle of Man. And then, much like his distant descendant, Henry VIII, he pulled out all the stops to annul the marriage because he realised it would be better off if he married King John's daughter. And the truth of it, I went through all this papal correspondence, and it's, I can't tell, to be honest. I can't tell if the marriage went ahead or not.
Yeah.
Well, of course, in those days, a betrothal was seen as binding as a marriage. So I suppose even if he was betrothed, you had to get a papal dispensation to annul the betrothal.
Whether he was actually married or not to this Runasht, he certainly wanted to sever the connection. And the letters that he sent that go back and forth to Rome, in which he's trying to persuade the Pope to let him do this, Llywelyn was quite ruthless about it. He had this, in order to get rid of her, he eventually had her sort of status downgraded so that she's eventually in these letters being described as a slave girl and a handmaid to downgrade her from she was a princess, she was the daughter of a king. And then there's this very kind of squalid, he claimed that she had previously slept with his uncle Rodri. And the Pope had to send a team of inquisitors to Gwynedd to talk to people who'd known Rodri, because he was dead by this point, and to ask whether they had seen him go into his bedchamber with this girl, who would have been 11 at this point, and whether this was consummated. So the Pope actually sends his agents all the way from Rome to North Wales to talk to his old servants to determine whether or not Uncle Rodri had had sexual relations with an underage girl. And if that was proved, that meant Llywelyn could get rid of her and marry Joan. And in the end, the Pope seems to have accepted Llywelyn's version of events. And this girl, who is not explicitly named in any of these letters, you have to sort of get her name from how many daughters did the King of Man have at this point? Oh, it must have been her. She's eventually cast aside, and we don't actually know what happens to her. She's just sort of disposed of, which is, I think comparisons with Henry VIII are quite sort of apt. It's quite sort of distasteful, really. You've got these letters going back and forth between Llywelyn and this old man in Rome, and this girl has no say. She has no influence. She's not named, and eventually he kicks her aside on the basis that she's not really a princess either. Llywelyn would have justified it on the grounds that I need to secure my dynasty, I need to protect myself against England. I've made a terrible mistake. I mean, what use is the Isle of Man to me?
When you've got England.
Yeah, I mean, if I get invaded by the King of England, I'm going to call upon the might of man and his 50 warriors, you know. So you can see why he does it. I just think it's a bit of a shame from the girl's point of view. And I would like to know, I'd feel, you know, I'd like to know what happened to her. Was she put away in a convent, or did she go back to the Isle of Man, or what? It's very difficult to tell.
You said that he had trouble with the son that we know existed. So how did that affect the succession with the children he had with Joan?
It caused all sorts of trouble because the succession laws in Wales, as I've sort of alluded to, were very far from clear cut. And basically Griffith, even though he was now considered to be the son of a totally invalid mother, that even if he was illegitimate, under Welsh law, he had as good a right to any other royal children to inherit. And Llywelyn wants his eldest son by Joan, Dafydd, to succeed to everything. And he tries very hard to replace the system of partible inheritance in Wales with primogeniture. And in about 1220, he manages to persuade the Pope to agree. And you get these quite forcefully written letters in which the Pope says that the system of succession in Wales is disgusting. And the idea that you can have bastards, illegitimate sons inheriting is contrary to the law, to all reason, to the laws of God and man. And yes, quite right. So Dafydd stands to inherit everything, and then he has several sisters, daughters by Joan, who are very useful. Llywelyn marries them off, notably to the Marcher Lords. He doesn't marry them off to other Welsh princes. He marries them to the Browes family, the Mortimers. One of them, Gladys the Black, she is married to two in succession, and eventually is married to Ralph Mortimer, which gives the Mortimers, the later generations of the Mortimers, a claim to be princes of Wales, as well as their other claims to the English crown, which makes them very dangerous. But Griffith is left out on a bit of a limb, really, because what does Llywelyn do with this boy? He's his eldest son, but he doesn't want him to inherit, too much. And he's, for the next sort of 20, 30 years, he passes Griffith around like a parcel. At one point, he gives him to King John as a hostage. But the English give him back again after about a year. They're like, well, don't want him, So Llywelyn then goes, oh, well, I'll give him a bit of land. I'll give him a bit of power. And he gives him some land in Powys, which is adjacent to Gwynedd. And then a couple of years later, he takes it away again because he decides that Griffith is incompetent. And then Griffith, who's a grown man by this point, he decides he's sick of being pushed around by his dad. And so they fight a war. And then they sort of make peace, and he's given another lordship for a few years, and then he's grabbed and thrown into prison for 6 years. Basically, Llywelyn cannot decide what to do with Griffith, and he doesn't want to kill him or anything like that, but he can't find a place for him. And Dafydd, unsurprisingly, has no love for Griffith as he grows up, and they grow up to be enemies. And this really complicates the succession in Wales, and it's one of the things that Llywelyn never quite gets to grips with, and it causes ructions, problems in the future after his death.
Yeah, because it's actually, Dafydd doesn't have any children, does he? So it's actually Griffith's sons who are Llewellyn's heirs in the end.
Yes, ironically, yeah. Griffith has 4 sons and a daughter. Dafydd dies, he's only 33 when he dies. Has a very short and troubled reign, only about 6 years, in which he spends most of the time fighting Henry III. And it's possible that he's murdered in the end because he dies of this very strange illness. All his hair and teeth fall out, and he's quite possibly poisoned. When you consider how many people wanted him out of the way, It's a bit like JFK. You know, how many how many people shot him? It's far from clear who might have disposed of him, but it might have been Griffith or Henry or one of his other enemies. It's a long-term consequence of Llywelyn, despite all his many sort of successes. He can't really he cannot secure the succession because he made this mistake right at the start of his career. And you could say it's a sort of delayed vengeance from his first wife. You might have kicked me aside, but I've left you this son who's going to vex you forever.
So what were Llewellyn's greatest achievements?
Well, there were many. I think his sort of greatest achievement was to impose his power and control over Welsh Wales, or Pura Walia, the part of Wales that was ruled by Welsh kings and lords. And he does this very efficiently. I mean, it takes him about 20 years or so because there's always conflict within Wales. But he does it, and he's more successful than all of his ancestors. And they include some very formidable people like Griffith ap Llywelyn in the 11th century, Owain Gwynedd. They had all achieved the same thing, but only on a very temporary basis. Llywelyn manages to do this by about 1220 and then hold on to that sort of control for the remainder of his life, the next 20 years. And at the same time, he plays this very clever game with the martial lords and the kings of England. Apart from his very nasty moment in 1211, he manages to hold them off via not just military means, but by marriage, uses his sort of children by Joan, in this sort of Game of Thrones politics very efficiently.
Yeah, I think with that one, I like the idea of the children and the marriage. I mean, to show how much he saw the marriage of these children as being so important, he married one to the son of the man he'd accused of sleeping with his wife.
Yeah, William de Braose, wasn't it? Yes.
Oh no, sorry, it was the daughter.
Yeah, that's it. He
Yeah.
married David to Isabel, I think it is, who is the daughter of the man who. There's this scandalous incident, isn't there, where William de Braose is discovered in his Llywelyn's bedchamber with his wife Joan, and they're clearly having some sort of affair. And Llywelyn hangs William de Braose. He kills him. And I'd really like to know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious what was going on, but you wish for a bit more detail. You get this very, very, very brief chronicle account.
Yeah, and he sends the letters to William's wife saying, "I hope this doesn't put you off for continuing with the marriage." Right.
Yeah, sorry about this, but I've killed. I mean, this happened about 1230, I think, by which point Llywelyn is pushing 60. And if you're talking about the true nature of this man, he's achieved an enormous amount in 30 years, and a pretty hard-boiled politician, and somebody you wouldn't mess with. And you have to wonder what on earth William de Braose was thinking. I mean, it's like, oh, this is fine. There's no risk here.
Yeah.
And Joan as well. I haven't read Dana Messer's biography of Joan. I should do, because I think a lot of the time these sort of princesses, these noblewomen, they appear as, oh, he married her and then she had X number of children and then she died. It's like they don't, just the bare facts give you this impression that they didn't have much agency. They didn't have much sort of independence. Well, Joan clearly did. She had an affair at quite an advanced age, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think that was her saving grace, because she'd already produced the children and there was no danger by that point of her getting pregnant.
Would I didn't check actually. Would William have been much younger than her when this was going on?
Possibly, yeah.
I get confused. They're all called William. There's one William de Braose after another.
Yeah, that's the problem. He was actually the grandson of the Maud who was murdered by John. But his dad was about 30 in 1210.
Yeah, and Joan was what?
He probably would have been in his late 20s, early 30s maybe. Joan was about 50, yeah.
Wow. I know there's a stage play about it, which I haven't seen. Which I must watch at some point. That sounds quite.
I haven't seen that.
But it's a great story, and it's one of these sort of episodes that stand out because it can sometimes, especially this period, it can sometimes come across as like a series of dates. this battle and that battle. And then you get this sort of human story where you go, oh yeah, they were actually people, and they were, random and flawed as the rest of us.
And you're like sitting there going, what on earth were they thinking?
Yeah, I mean, they must have really.
They cannot have expected it to turn out well.
And in his bedchamber, And I think the account says that it was Llewellyn himself who found them. He walked in and there they were. You just imagine the scene.
That's what I read. He got back early.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, it's great. Well, poor William, I suppose, but then, don't sleep with the wife of this extremely scary man. But
a bloke who'd held him prisoner for a while as well. It's like he knew what he was like.
But as you say, despite that, I think he reconciled with Joan formally after a few months. And he kept this alliance going. So, he was pragmatic to a fault. It's like, well, okay. Yeah. I mean, he had his revenge. He killed the man who had, seduced his wife. And beyond that, he's like, well, I'm not going to break this alliance. So, that was an interesting moment.
I suppose it just goes to show that he was the politician first. He was thinking of the alliance.
I suppose he hanged William de Braouse. I mean, that could have had serious repercussions to actually hang a marcher lord. I can't think of many other times where something like that happened. It doesn't seem to have caused too much trouble. It's like the other marchers went, well, he was sleeping with his wife.
Yeah.
What do you expect?
I suppose it was the one thing, it was the one transgression that all the lords could understand Llewellyn's reaction.
But you do sort of wonder, don't sleep with the wives of these powerful men. What are you doing? No.
It's not going to end well.
So in terms of, obviously, you've pretty much said that the succession was a failure. Were there other failures that you would say that he had?
Yeah, there were. I think one of his big mistakes, he came to an agreement with Henry III in 1218, the Treaty of Worcester, which in most respects was very favourable to Llewellyn. It kind of further cemented his power in Wales. But one of the clauses, he agreed to look after the sons of one of his great enemies, Gwenwyn Wyn, who was the Prince of Powys, one of the other great Welsh lordships. And Llewellyn had defeated Gwenwyn Wyn and driven him into exile in England. And he died in 1216 in exile, but he left 4 sons. And Henry III actually said to Llewellyn, well, as part of this exchange, I can give you custody of these boys and you can look after them in your court growing up, which would have been a very good idea, because he would have taken the sons of his enemy and kind of brought them up in his own households, married them off to some convenient noblewoman. They'd been his friends, his allies, and neutralized any threat from that quarter. And Llewellyn actually promised to do this. It says in the treaty, I will look after these boys. And he doesn't. He broke that agreement for whatever reason. And instead, they were brought up at the court of the Earl of Chester. And they grew up to be sworn enemies of the House of Gwynedd. And the eldest boy, Griffith, he was one of Edward I's greatest allies in Wales, and he did more than anyone to destroy the House of Gwynedd. It's easy to judge in hindsight, but if Llewellyn had agreed and lived up to his own promise and brought these boys up in his own household, they wouldn't have grown up as his enemies. So I think that was a real political blunder. And of course, he dies in 1240, so he lives long enough to see the consequences. These boys grow up. And from about 1230, they are very much attacking Gwynedd, leading like raids into Gwynedd. They're very much hell-bent on recovering their father's land. So that was a mistake. And his other failure, which might have been, it sounds harsh because there might have been no way of resolving this. All of his power and his success was very personal. It depended on his own ability and his own sort of presence. He suffers a very debilitating stroke in 1237, but he lives on for another 3 years. And this really shows the personal nature of his authority, because according to Welsh tradition, any ruler who's less than physically whole had no right to hold on to power. And that was why a defeated Welsh ruler would be blinded and castrated, because a man without his eyes and his testicles is clearly no good as a ruler. And a man who suffers a stroke, and it's a really crippling stroke as well, Llywelyn couldn't walk for the remainder of his life. He should, according to custom, have been pushed aside, but he wasn't. He clung on to power for the remainder of his life. But the problem is this sort of control, this authority he had set up was on very shaky foundations. It was basically his personal achievement, and he couldn't set up a sort of very stable succession to continue beyond his death. And within a year of his death, everything is unraveling. I mean, it takes longer for this whole edifice to come crashing down. But I think, in my opinion, Llywelyn was the greatest of the rulers of Gwynedd, maybe one of the greatest princes of Wales, medieval Wales. But even he couldn't sort of secure Wales under a single ruler.
I think that's the nature of medieval kingship, though, isn't it? That it is personal.
Yeah. I mean, I think in an ideal world, what they needed to do was copy the example of somebody like Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, who deliberately picked the most boringly competent man he could find to succeed him as emperor, Antoninus. And he was a really good emperor, and everything was fine for the next 25 years because he was just this very competent, boring man who didn't really want to do anything except keep things stable. So if somebody like Llywelyn, instead of concentrating on succession in terms of children, which is an unfair criticism because that's what they did, this was their culture. If he just picked out somebody like his own seneschal, Ednived Vychan, who was a very, very competent servant and basically sort of governed Wales, much of Wales on Llywelyn's behalf, if he'd said, well, you can be my successor, and he would have governed Wales perfectly fine, but he didn't have the status. He was a freeman. He wasn't a prince. So, I mean, to say it's Llywelyn's failure is kind of a bit like saying, well, it's the whole society's failure, which is it's unfair, really.
Yeah. It's the nature of princes, isn't it? You can't control what happens once you're gone.
No.
I mean, they all tried to do it. Henry VIII, again, tried to do it with his...
It's funny, I was just going to say Henry VIII. It's like, you could have said to Henry, look, forget about all this son's business. Give the crown to Thomas Cromwell. You're a great king. I mean, the man's a gangster, but that's great.
They're all gangsters.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just some of them wear crowns.
Yeah, exactly.
So whenever there's a great involved, we do tend to ask the question, was he great? And Llywelyn IV is also known as Llywelyn the Great. So was he? Does he deserve it?
Well, that's an interesting one because there is actually, the first thing is there's very little evidence that he was called Llywelyn the Great in his own lifetime. In fact, there's none. The first time he's called Llywelyn the Great is in a charter of Edward I, in which he's called Llywelyn Magni, which is probably simply defining him as Llywelyn Senior, as opposed to his grandson, Llywelyn ap Griffith. It can mean great, but basically it means big Llywelyn.
Yeah.
Llywelyn the Elder. Depends how you interpret the Latin.
Yeah.
So he's supposed to be Llywelyn the Fat or something rather than it's just somebody misread it.
Yeah, Llywelyn the Rotund.
Yeah, Llywelyn the Chubby.
In his own day, he's Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, but I don't think that matters so much whether he was called Llywelyn the Great, because nobody was in any doubt as to his status. He was very careful to use certain titles. He never called himself Prince of Wales or King of Wales or anything like that. He was Prince of North Wales, Lord of Snowdon, Lord of Gwynedd. But his power, in practical terms, extended far beyond that. I'm wary of greatness because as soon as you describe somebody as great, it's kind of like inviting criticism. Alfred the Great or Canute the Great or whoever. And I'm always reminded of Terry Pratchett when he said, if you've got a king who's called Great, you can bet your bottom dollar that he was some psychopath who broke heads and laughed about it. But that aside, as I've said, he was very successful, at least in the short term. He did everything that a sort of medieval prince in Wales or anywhere else was supposed to do. I mean, he had his failings, but yeah, I mean, perhaps Llywelyn the Great, we could call him something like Llywelyn the really, really good.
Llywelyn the above average.
Well above average. He's well above, 8 out of 10. Come on. 9. Give him a 9. I mean, certainly, I think a lesser man would have not have lasted so long. And he was a very, very competent military leader, a very competent politician. Had his troubles with his family, but then you could say that about the greatest of the kings of England, someone like Henry II, endless trouble. So, in a word, yes. Yes, I would say.
Excellent. So, what are you working on now? What's your current focus?
At the moment, I'm writing a novel, and it's about a man named Philip of Cognac, who was an illegitimate son of Richard the Lionheart. He was Richard's only acknowledged son. He might have had others, but Philip was the only one he acknowledged. I thought he might make for a good story because he coincides with things like the Fourth Crusade. And we don't know much about him. There's only a couple of entries mentioning him, usual thing with the illegitimate sons. So I could do pretty much what I like with him. And we don't know what happened to him either. He last appears in 1201, being given some money by King John, his uncle, and then he vanishes. So I thought he could go off and join the crusade and get up to all sorts. And then from then on, it's just sheer invention, really.
And is that a standalone, or is it going to be a series?
It'll hopefully be a series. There's more than enough. As soon as I get him over to the east, to the Roman Empire, to Constantinople and what's now Asia Minor, Turkey, there's more than enough going on. So he can get involved in all sorts. And in the early bits, he can have this relationship with Richard and John and Eleanor of Aquitaine, who are all these fascinating figures that people who are into this era of history, they're all very recognizable.
Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah. I've just finished Catherine Hanley's Lioness Heart.
Oh yeah.
So he did get a mention in there.
Yeah,
so,
he's interesting. Yeah. Philip. Richard gave him the lordship of Cognac in Aquitaine, but then took it away again, and we don't know why. So I had to sort of make up reasons for that. And of course, John had loads of illegitimate sons and gave them all sorts of useful jobs to do. They were, bastard sons could be quite useful if you did the right thing. That's something Llywelyn never quite grasped. But
well, it's like Henry I had something like 20.
Oh my gosh, 25
plus illegitimate children.
Yeah,
and he made sure they were all sorted. They were all,
my gosh,
provided for.
Went over to Ireland and were in Wales. I think it's the 25 definite, but probably more scattered all over the place. Yeah.
Yes, he put himself about a bit.
He certainly did. My gosh.
Well, it was great because marrying off his illegitimate daughters was wonderful because he could give you're marrying into the royal family, but there's not passing on any claim to the throne whatsoever.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah. And of course, the sons. This is something John grasped. They're totally reliant on their fathers for patronage. They're not going to get anywhere. So you're not going to have any sort of Henry II situation where his legitimate sons are giving him all sorts of trouble, because if they annoy the father, they'll be cut off with nothing. So you better behave.
I think that's what Henry I planned to do. Unfortunately, the fact that his only legitimate son died before him caused no end of problems.
Yeah. Henry, he needed an heir and a spare, didn't he?
Well, seeing how he had had so many arguments with his own brothers, you can understand why he didn't want to pass that on
Yeah.
into his son's generation. But at the same time, that did rely on the son surviving.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it wasn't possible at the time, but what he really needed to do was legitimize Robert of Gloucester, because he was great.
Yeah.
But I guess that wasn't an option.
No, the church had tightened up its rules on illegitimate children inheriting crowns. I think sometime shortly after William the Conqueror took England, it was like, oh, we can't have illegitimate children doing that.
No, you're quite happy to sponsor them to do it, but then
Hold on a minute.
God, this guy's getting too powerful.
What's the point of getting married? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Where will this end?
Yeah, so Philip I thought was interesting. As far as I know, he is a character in the Shakespeare play, King John. He's Philip of Fauconberg, but we don't know who his mother was. Shakespeare made up a fictional Lady Fauconberg. But Richard is sometimes interpreted as being homosexual. But the fact he had a son out of wedlock, and then there's one chronicle says that he was actually in the habit of seducing the wives of his lords in Aquitaine.
Yes,
you know, I suspect that.
But he did share a bed with Philip II. You know, and that's the whole basis of it.
I mean, the obvious comparison there is that Edward I shared a bed with Thomas de Clare, and unless anybody wants to try and remold Longshanks as a homosexual,
and Edward IV did it with
Edward IV, even
Somerset.
better, with the Duke of Somerset.
Oh, did he? With Somerset?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
The idea is you can sleep.
Scandal.
Yeah.
You're sleeping with your enemy, and you're trusting your enemy to not kill you. It's nothing.
Yeah,
But...
I have to say, I'm surprised Edward IV got away with that. I thought Somerset had been stabbing him in his sleep.
Well, they were best buddies at that point. He was forgiven.
Right.
And there were probably about 4 armed guards around the bed staying awake, just in case.
I think Edward IV was pretty laid back about these things.
I should imagine most of the time he was sort of passed out on the floor in a drunken stupor rather than in bed. But the other thing about Philip, which Elizabeth Chadwick is quite baffled by, is that Richard called him Philip because Philip Augustus, Richard's great enemy. And you know, you think of the last thing that
you've got all these names to choose from.
and you called him Philip. Oh my God. But then he was probably born in the early 1180s when Philip Augustus and Richard had yet to fall out.
And Philip II may have been godfather, possibly.
Yes, he could have been. There's a trouble with illegitimate sons. The records are so spotty. John was quite generous to him. He gave him a Christmas gift of 50 marks, which, you know, by John's standards was quite a nice thing to do. But then Philip was no threat. You know, he wasn't going to give him any trouble.
I was going to say, at the same time, Arthur of Brittany was in a tower in Rouen, breathing his last.
Yeah, exactly. And he would have been Philip's first cousin, I think.
First cousin,
First cousin, yeah. So it shows, what would you rather be, legitimate or illegitimate? Well, I'll take the 50 marks.
And then go on the Fourth Crusade, because get as far away from John as possible before he changes his mind.
I would. I mean, I've been to Istanbul several times, but I would love to gain access to their archives because I think they'd have all sorts that we don't have access to in the West. All kinds of records of crusaders and who actually went on these expeditions. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to discover a reference in Greek to a Philippos, you know, son of King Richard, being granted some minor fief in Turkey or something.
Yeah.
And thanks very much for joining us today, David.
No problem.
Been absolutely fabulous. Really enjoyed it and found it very interesting. Welsh history, I think my introduction was Sharon Penman. And I think that's the same with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think I came to it through Ellis Peters, the Cadfael novel. I'm still very fond of Ellis Peters, and then people like Cecilia Holland, and then Sharon Penman and good old Jean Plady. A bit lighter, kind of romantic side of things, but I, still very, very sort of good, very entertaining.
Yes. And we can't forget mentioning Kevin Ashman, who's they're a little bit more violent than Sharon Penman's books, but also well worth reading.
Yeah. He wrote novels about 13th century Wales, doesn't he? As well as Templars and things. Yeah. So yeah, I think medieval Wales is hopefully becoming more. I don't know, more people are gaining a greater interest and understanding in it, both in sort of like the academic side of things.
Yes.
And I mean, humans, we tend to turn everything into stories. We storify absolutely everything, and there are so many stories in Wales. Partially because there's so many families, so many dynasties, and they sort of rise and fall, and they do all sorts of extraordinary things. I mean, I could talk about Welsh kings forever, but I don't know who to. But put a wall.
Yeah.
Well, we haven't done too bad today, actually, and that was only talking about one of them. So maybe we'll do a series sometime in the future. Thank you very much, David Pilling. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much to David Pilling. Do join us next week when we will actually be talking about Lioness Heart, Joanna of England, King Richard the Lionheart's baby sister, with Catherine Hanley. I'm really looking forward to that. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Remember that all our podcasts are available on YouTube. Just search on the Slice of Medieval. And don't forget to subscribe either on YouTube or your favourite podcast provider. It'd be great if you had time to give us a like or a comment. But anyway, thanks for listening.